So excited to be here, Nick, that my microphone appears to have jumped off spontaneously from my belt. We'll keep it there in its right place. It's a huge privilege, actually, on this first day that Nick Burns is back with us at HKS, to be able to welcome him and actually also, in the gentlest possible manner, interrogate him about what he's been up to for the last 5 years when you were away from the classroom. And I think it's particularly wonderful on a day when you've returned to us from the land of the Red Star to the land of the Red Sox, of whom I believe you are something of a fan. We're going to spend quite a bit of our time talking about the US-China relationship and also the changing way in which that's affecting global international relations, as well as what's happening inside China itself, which you observe. But before we start, Nick, could I ask you to share a moment or two from your years as ambassador in China? Because just to remind people, amongst other things, that was the era of COVID. It was the era when actually the relationship between the US and China, of course, was extraordinarily unusual in many ways, but also a very difficult time to be in diplomatic service in Beijing. So what stood out for you?
Rana, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. First of all, I want to say about Rana, the last thing I did at Harvard Kennedy School before I left 3.5 years ago was to attend the lecture that an incoming professor candidate gives to the Harvard faculty. It was brilliant. We're so pleased and so fortunate to have Rana as one of our senior professors studying China. The other thing I want to say is how great it is to be back after 3.5 years. This is my first day. I'm not even on the email system yet, but I've been to a faculty meeting, Erica, and I've also been to a Bell for lunch, and there's someone else who's here on his very first day. And I can now say as a member of the Harvard faculty how pleased we are that Jake Sullivan is joining the faculty today. And I just admire Jake so much for his scholarship, for his patriotism, for his public service. I was 8,000 miles away from him, but on my toughest days, Jake always had my back and always had a good idea. So maybe, Jake, you can stand up and we can salute you. So we could organize an entire course around Rana's question. The way we talked about it beforehand is maybe what was my worst day and what was one of the better days. The worst day category probably outnumbers by a factor of 100 the better days in a very difficult competitive relationship between the two countries. I think then Jake will remember this. I think Speaker Pelosi's visit, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, early August 2022, the reaction of the Chinese government to that. They shut down 8 channels of cooperation with the United States on fentanyl, on talking about arms control, really important subjects, and some of those channels weren't revived for an entire year. And the reaction to that taught me, and I was a new ambassador, I'd only been there 7 months, that we were in a situation where there was very little trust, and we didn't have senior levels of communication that year. In fact, what we wanted to do before the Pelosi visit and in the wake of it was to talk. We wanted Jake and Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin to be able to do that, and the Chinese shut down those senior channels. That was a bad day, a bad time. The most mysterious crisis was the balloon crisis. You remember that balloon that floated across the national territory of the United States for 5 whole days. People in Montana were shooting at it, and it was a big crisis. And part of the just strange nature of the relationship, maybe even the dysfunctional nature of that relationship, was when President Biden did the right thing by ordering the balloon to be shot down in American territory, our territorial waters off the coast of South Carolina. I was called in by the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister, who's a very good diplomat. He's now the ambassador in Washington, somebody I respect, Ambassador Xie Feng. He blamed us for the crisis. I thought that was an Orwellian twist on that 5 days. And so after that crisis, they shut down the relationship for another 3 months. And we decided, collectively in the Biden administration, the president decided, that we had to revive the relationship. In the summer of 2023, we began to re-engage, and that was our initiative. Secretary Blinken came out, Secretary Yellen came out, Secretary Raimondo, John Kerry. 100-year-old Henry Kissinger came out. And that was a meaningful visit by Secretary Kissinger. He arrived at 2 p.m. I met him at the airport. He said, let's go. And for 5 days, he met the Chinese leadership, and he was part of that revival. And then that led to the San Francisco summit, where President Biden and President Xi reestablished a working relationship where we could manage our differences. Those were tough days. And the common denominator is, in a relationship with not a lot of trust, with not, over a period of time, senior level communication, you really have to worry about a relationship. And I worried that we wouldn't be able to handle a crisis. I think we stabilized things in the latter part of 2003. And Rana, just because I do want to provide an upnote, much of what I had to do and much of what we did in the Biden administration was to compete with China. Military competition, tech competition, human rights, economic. And that was, I think, the majority of what I did, how I spent my time. And I'm sure Jake would say the same thing. But we also tried to engage them on climate change. We did engage them, I thought, quite productively. We tried to elevate senior military communication, had some success. Admiral Sam Pomparo, he's our senior military officer right now in the Indo-Pacific. He's had 2, and we publicized these, 2 consequential meetings with the Southern Theater commander of the PLA. So we reestablished that. President Biden pushed the Chinese leadership on fentanyl, and we began to get some progress. I think President Trump is right to continue pushing on fentanyl. So there's an engagement side of the relationship which we thought was important because sometimes our interests were aligned with China. Maybe the majority of the time they weren't, but you have to try to stabilize a relationship because you're not trying to fight, you're trying to coexist and operate on 2 different levels, competition, which is the majority, and engagement. The best day for me was late November of 24 when we were able to secure the release of 4 Americans who'd been held wrongly, unjustly, in Chinese prisons. 1 for 17 years, 1 for 12 years, 1 for 8 years, and 1 for 4 years. And I visited 3 of them, 3 on multiple occasions in their prison cells in Guangdong Province, Shanghai, and Beijing. And when they were able to be transferred to our custody, when I gave them their American passports, put them on the plane, when the plane took off and exited Chinese airspace, President Biden called them, then Secretary Blinken called them. And the last thing I did before I resigned on January 20th was Secretary Blinken and I had a video conference with the 4 of them now living in freedom, back with their families out of Chinese jails. So that was a good moment. And it's important to remember the good moments.
Very much so. We'll make sure that we cover both the good and the bad as we discuss the significance of many of those events. Nick, you've given us an account of what were some of the high points in terms of policy as well as people during those 3 years. And I think that's a natural place to ask you where you think the US-China relationship is now. And I think, this audience, particularly since they've chosen to come to you, will know a lot about the general subject. But just to give you a slightly counterintuitive vibe that comes from a lot of people who spend time looking at this relationship, right now it seems that unlike the current administration's policy towards Ukraine or indeed the Middle East, China seems to almost be on the back burner, at least for a while. There's very little that's been said, particularly at the very high levels, about where the US is going in terms of that relationship. What's your feeling?
I think it's a difficult relationship. Contentious, disputatious at times, very competitive. I talked about the 4 quadrants of competition, and this is really the heart of the relationship right now as I look at it. China wants to overtake us in military power and influence in the Indo-Pacific, and we can't let that happen. And President Biden spent a lot of time building up our strategic relations with our allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, strategic partnership with India. I think technology has moved to the center of this relationship. Who's going to be first mover commercially on AI and AGI, biotech, quantum computing, and there are going to be military spin-offs in revolutionary technology. We don't want to be behind the curve, and so we're competing. The president made a lot of strategic investments in the private sector and in universities, in R&D to universities, which is so important. We're talking about that right now in the United States, and that's what President Biden believed, that strengthened us for the competition. I talked to a senior member of our business community today who came back from the China Development Forum, and there is no level playing field for the more than 10,000 American businesses there in a $642 billion two-way trade relationship, our third largest trade partner. So that was a priority. So it's competitive, and it's competitive on human rights. I applaud what Secretary Rubio did yesterday. He sanctioned several Chinese officials for human rights violations in both Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. The Biden administration had done that, and now the Trump administration has done that. So, competition. But as I said before, we were very focused on not allowing that competition to get out of hand. Nightmare scenario would have been, it didn't happen on our watch, a collision of two naval vessels in the Spratlys or Paracels or the Senkakus. Could we handle that crisis? Could we manage it? Or, God forbid, something even greater on the military side. Jake managed for the administration and for the president, I thought, one of our most important dialogues. And I joined Jake, I think, for all but one of them. Jake met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and these were really unusual meetings. We would go to an isolated place. We went to Malta, we went to Bangkok, we went to a hotel up near the Great Wall outside of Beijing, and you also went to Vienna and maybe Jake should talk about this tonight if he cares to, for 2 days at a time, and very few people on both sides of the table. And you might have dinner and lunch, and you'd have long conversations. What we were trying to do, what Jake was trying to do, what we were trying to do is manage that difficult relationship, drive down the probability that any one of those competitive areas might lead us to a place we didn't want to go to with the Chinese.
Nick, what was the tone of those sorts of conversations? Because I think people would be fascinated to know that you were basically kind of doing this kind of global tour of interesting but slightly unlikely places and having these types of dialogues. I'm sure the competitive language was there, but were they calm, friendly, frenetic? What was the mood?
Depended on the timing of it, because we had some pretty sensitive issues to discuss. But I think they gave our side and their side time to spend 4 or 5 hours on a subject. In a normal diplomatic meeting, if you're doing a bilateral meeting, you're lucky, especially with consecutive translation, you're lucky to get 2 or 3 hours of good conversation. These were multiple days of conversation. I also think President Biden had 3 in-person summit meetings and also had phone calls and virtual meetings. And because of the Chinese system, where of course President Xi is the great, he makes most of the decisions. He wields extraordinary authority in that system. President Biden had to interact with President Xi, and those meetings were consequential. The Bali meeting brought us back from the controversy over Speaker Pelosi's visit, and I should hasten to say we supported her visit publicly. We certainly did in China and in the United States. The San Francisco meeting brought us back from the balloon crisis and the aftermath. And we were together, Jake and I, at the Lima meeting on November 15th, just 4 months ago, where they did some consequential business together. If you read the joint statement of that meeting, it talks about cooperation on fentanyl, military contacts at the senior level. There's one sentence that basically said, human beings should decide on the use of nuclear weapons, not AI machines. That is not an exact quotation. I used to have it imprinted in my brain. It's been a couple of months, but I remember us talking about that just before the meeting started. Will we get that? We did. So in this particular relationship, our Secretary of State, our National Security Advisor, our Ambassador can play a role, obviously, and we do, but it has to be at the presidential level, given the nature of the Chinese system. And President Biden, of course, had known Xi Jinping for a long time, and they had lots of meetings going back to 2010. So that was the apex of our diplomacy.
I would say in some ways people might find it rather reassuring that both sides were willing to hold these long and kind of free-form meetings, in the sense the fact that at least that conversation could take place is actually a sign that diplomacy, is something that both sides are willing to work with.
It was important for a lot of reasons. One of them is And one can be frank when you're out of government, and I don't want to be dismissive if anyone is here who's a citizen of China or, obviously supports their government. There is a certain sterility, sterile nature to our daily diplomatic conversation. And my team and I, we have a great team, by the way, of public servants in China, of men and women who had trained, many of them at this school, who spoke Mandarin fluently, and they were our daily interaction with the government of China. But there were days and weeks and months where we couldn't agree that the sky was blue. I mean, we couldn't even get to establishing facts and then disagree on over the facts. What policy measures should we both undertake? And that was particularly true of the balloon crisis. Yep. What was it? Who sent it? And so I thought to overcome the sterile nature of that daily business, you had to get senior leaders in a position where they had some time, where they could relax a little bit, where there weren't cameras in front of them, and even great reporters asking, like David Sanger, asking questions. And that's what this dialogue was able to do, in part, and I think it was really very welcome and very successful.
Indeed. Maybe it's a sign of China's adaptation to green technology that the sky in Beijing was in fact blue on that occasion, since there have been many occasions in the past.
Well, it is. I made my first trip to China in July of 1988. I'll never forget it, was Secretary George Shultz. I was a very junior Foreign Service officer. The sky was not blue. And if you went back, 98, 2008, Graham will testify to this. I mean, frankly, the air quality in Beijing and Shanghai especially, Tianjin, is far better than it was. And I think the Chinese take great pride in that.
And also, to add to that particular point, it was actually the US Embassy for a long time that was monitoring air quality and helped to push China in the direction of getting much cleaner air. So,
Ambassador Gary Locke, who was one of President Obama's ambassadors, he put that air quality index monitor there. I climbed up my first week, up the big ladder, saw it, and now we're also measuring ozone layers, which is also a threat. But that was an early way for us to communicate to the people of China, and through the science, maybe under and over the firewall, that there's free information out there about something that concerns you.
Absolutely. Let me also, as you've done, welcome Jake Sullivan to the school. It's wonderful to have you here, Jake. And I'm going to use you as an excuse to ask a specific question coming from what you've just told us, Nick. It's about technology and it's about conversations with China. One phrase very much associated with our new colleague is the phrase small yard, high fence. In other words, the idea that when it comes to crucial technology, and I think Michael McQuaid, who's here, will know all about that too, that the number of things restricted will be relatively small, but the access to them will be highly restricted. When you brought that concept to your Chinese interlocutors, what did they say? How did they react?
Well, it was October 2022, and it was just before the 20th Party Congress. And so we brought a highly complex set of export restrictions, export controls to the Chinese. I delivered it to the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and frankly, we didn't hear much for a couple of weeks. I think they were, for two reasons. One, they were focused on the Party Congress, number one. Number two, this was a new way of the United States making the right decision to say, we're not going to give the PLA and the Chinese intelligence services our most sensitive technology so that they can compete with us more effectively. And that was President Biden's decision. And I thought small yard, high fence, the fact that we were de-risking but not decoupling the two economies, that's an important distinction. I said before, we have a $642 billion two-way trade relationship last year in goods and services. And we did not want to, and I think we still should not, decouple the two economies. There's too much riding on global economic stability for that to happen. And it would be injurious to the United States and to our business community and to the people who work for our businesses and profit from our businesses in terms of consumers. And yet, a fundamental lesson of the pandemic is we don't want to be reliant on critical materials and critical minerals from China, and we don't want them to receive advanced semiconductors for AI purposes. So the logic of it was clear. It is the right policy. I don't know what the Trump administration will do, but my guess is they're going to maintain. In fact, last week they actually announced a strengthening of the policy. So we have a little indication that they're sticking with it, which is a very good thing. The Chinese reacted then, following the 20th Party Congress, furiously. They disagreed with it. We've had a million conversations about it. We point out, I certainly did in those conversations, you're actually doing the same thing. In Made in China 2025, which they promulgated in 2015, they decided there were certain technologies they would not allow produced in China to be exported to the United States. And they still do that. They have restrictions on Chinese private equity investment in some American companies, just as we do. So all's fair, and this makes eminent sense if we're in a competition for military power, that we're not going to just allow American companies to sell our most advanced technology.
Well, we're not, fortunately, and hopefully we'll never be in a military conflict, but another sort of war, at least in the words of some, is happening right now, a trade war. And one of the things that we've seen, well, first of all, tomorrow, 2nd April, if we are to believe what we're told, there'll be a Liberation Day, which is a statement. It's a word actually China knows very well. 解放 is used to refer usually to 1949 and the arrival of the communist troops in the major cities of China. Slightly different sort of liberation going on here, I think. But it has largely to do with the imposition of tariffs on goods coming into the United States. And I note that in China, if I have it right, they've just put a whole variety of kind of preemptive tariffs on beef imports, which just happen to be a major export to the state of Montana, where Senator Daines, who I think has been trying to negotiate a meeting between the President of China and the President of the United States, is there at the moment, suggesting that the Chinese both know how to target and haven't entirely lost their sense of humor. Overall, do you think that this is a little hiccup in the relationship, or do you think that actually this move towards tariffs is going to spell the future of the US-China relationship for the next few years?
Ron, a great question. I think it's not a hiccup, it's a major issue and a major challenge. It was for the Biden administration, it is for the Trump administration. Secretary Yellen visited China for 6.5 days a year ago in both Guangzhou and Beijing. And her message was, to the Chinese, you're producing 2 to 3 times domestic demand in EVs, solar panels, lithium batteries, steel, and robotics. You're selling around the world below the cost of production. In the intervening year, who has raised tariffs? Which countries have raised tariffs on China? India, Turkey, South Africa, a close friend of China, Brazil, another close friend, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Canada, the United States of America, and the European Union. This is not just a US-China thing. It's China trying to maintain its GDP growth rate. They've got another target of this year for, they say, about 5%. One way to do that is ramp up domestic manufacturing, but then it becomes the problem for the rest of the world. A year ago, May 24th, President Biden raised tariffs on China. 100% Chinese EVs, 50% Chinese semiconductors, 25% Chinese lithium batteries. And so those tariffs have been maintained by President Trump. President Biden had maintained earlier tariffs from President Trump's first term. And frankly, I think that the 20% tariffs that President Trump has put on and the corresponding 20% tariffs that the Chinese have now applied to match us, they're proportional. Neither has started from a level where they're trying to set the world on fire or bring the house down in the trade relationship. It's just a guess from me, and I think from other people, that we may be looking at the initial maneuvering and leveraging, which is customary in these types of negotiations, but I wouldn't be surprised if by some point this year, maybe just before or at a first summit meeting, they end up in a trade deal rather than a sustained trade war. You can call it a trade war now. It is. One of the sensitive, and I'll end on this point, points for us is American agriculture depends on trade with China. 1/5 of our ag exports go to China. In 2022, the high water mark, our farmers, ranchers, and fishing industry sold $41 billion worth of products to China. The Chinese have cut that down below $30 billion. They're using that right now to try to leverage themselves, our position. But I do think a sustained trade war wouldn't be in the interest of either country, and that President Trump has been talking publicly about a summit meeting, And they made a trade deal the last time, so I think I would put my bet there. But of course...
You think there will be a summit meeting in the fairly near future, then?
I don't, when the administration started, they were talking publicly about an early summit meeting, I don't know. The talk is now it could be in the autumn. One thing, just having worked with the Chinese on summit planning, they do want to have everything worked out before the summit starts. So a lot of work needs to be done, and I credit Senator Gaines for traveling last week to China Development Forum. Here's another point, Ron, about our relationship. We got to keep our people connected. And yet for the last 5.5 years now, we've had one governor visit China. It was Governor Gavin Newsom in October 2023. And until Senator Daines set foot in Beijing last week, we'd had exactly one congressional delegation in 5.5 years. That was Senator Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer, a year and a half ago. And, we need more connectivity by members of Congress. We need, I think, to keep Chinese students coming to the United States.
You actually made quite a big splash on Chinese students during your last year as ambassador, Nick, when you talked about the disparate numbers between US students going to China, Chinese students in the US. Could you just give us those numbers again? Everyone may not know them.
Pre-COVID, there were 375,000 Chinese students in the United States. As of the end of December 24, there were 277,000, so significant decline, but the Chinese students are the leading group undergraduate in the United States, second among graduate students, second to India for the very first time in 2024. The problem, and we took the position as an administration that we implemented an executive order that President Trump had put into place in 2020 that essentially says, if you arrive at our visa window at Embassy Beijing or Consulate Shanghai and you're a Chinese, want to go to graduate school and study nuclear physics or nuclear weapons design at Caltech, you're probably not going to get the visa. You're definitely not going to get it. That's a very slim number of applicants, but we do screen for that. And it's actually an important screen, and we believe that was the right screen. But we took the position that we wanted Chinese students in the United States. We wanted young Americans and young Chinese to get to know each other and to study together, because you don't want two societies to be decoupled. The problems on the American student side, we had high water mark 15,000 Americans in China in 2015. By 2022, we were down to 350 American students. We're now up, we were at the day I left, which was January 14th when I flew out, we were at 1,105. Why do I know that number? We counted. We called every university in China and said, do you have an American student? The number was 1,104. And then I went to Guizhou University in the first week of December. I talked to the president of the university. I said, do you have any American students? He said, yes. And this American student appeared from behind a curtain. He was there. And he was this young man, 19 years old, from Sacramento, California. I said, why are you here? In Guizhou, which is a beautiful place. He said, when I was in high school, he said, in Sacramento, my girlfriend was from the Baha'i community, and she had immigrated to the United States. I said, is she still your girlfriend? No. But I still came. And I came to China, and he spoke fluent Mandarin. He lived with Chinese students in a dorm. He's passionate about the relationship. He wants to come to the Kennedy School, and we should admit him when he applies. And he wants to be part of a new American administration that knows China. So I said, Jared, you are 1,105. So we've got to keep connections academically, people like you, making bridges academically to the Chinese. If we get into a situation where we begin to say, can't have students meeting together, can't have business people. We had 5.5 million tourists going back and forth. That's a $30 billion industry for the United States, and that's evaporated. I don't think we'll do well in this relationship if the bottom falls off out of our social contact, and so I think that's an important thing for us to maintain.
Since you're out of post and free to speak now, Nick, I'm going to ask you a straight question.
Not about everything.
Well, right. I'll put the question to you. You're welcome to try and dodge it. What do you think should happen about Taiwan, and what do you think will happen about Taiwan?
So I just met with the Harvard undergrads, and many of them are here, who are part of the IOP forum, and they're really smart undergraduate students, and we talked about Taiwan. This is such a complex subject. We should teach a course on this here, but you'd need 5 months.
I believe there's some experts in the audience.
We've had remarkable success, every president now, for 53 years. We've maintained a one China policy, and we've not deviated from it. And we've also implemented, since January 1st, 1979, the Taiwan Relations Act, and those are the twin pillars. And they've worked, and they've kept peace across the Taiwan Strait. And I personally believe, but more importantly, President Biden believed we should maintain that policy. It's been successful. The Taiwan Relations Act is interesting. It says many things. 2 of them that pertain to what we must do are we must provide defensive military technology to the legitimate defense needs of Taiwan. And second, the United States must maintain a sufficient military presence in the region to ensure the peace. We've done that. And the Biden administration felt it was important to try to expand and strengthen the deterrent capacity of the Taiwan authorities. We did that. I was very pleased to see that last week the Trump administration announced another tranche of support publicly for the Taiwan authorities. Pleased to see Secretary Hegseth say that he supported that his President Trump supported it, and pleased to see him say in both Tokyo and Manila that the United States supported our treaty commitments. That's part of the Taiwan configuration. Last point in a very difficult, complicated subject. Isn't it incumbent on the authorities in Beijing to commit themselves to a peaceful resolution of this dispute? They announced yesterday significant military exercises. This happened repeatedly when I served there, when we served together. These are simulated attacks on the people who are living in a free society in Taiwan. And it's not right, it's not smart, it raises the temperature. And so we are right to ask the question, shouldn't everyone around the world pressure the authorities in Beijing to commit to a peaceful resolution? And Secretary Blinken started talking publicly any chance he could get, and he was right to do it. Think of the economic consequences to the global economy should the Taiwan Strait be shut down, because 50% of the container traffic monthly goes through that strait. So I think the pressure, frankly, shouldn't be on us. We have a one China policy that works. It should be on the authorities in Beijing.
In a moment or two, I want to get to audience questions, because I know there will be lots of them. But I want to just put one more question to you about the future before we move to our audience here, Nick. Right now, I think we're all aware that world order is changing very fast, often in a matter of hours, let alone days and weeks. But I think one thing that is going to be constant, and actually something we're studying at the Belfer Center through the Middle Powers Project, which Megan O'Sullivan and other colleagues are putting together, very, very important project, I think, is understanding how the countries that aren't the US and China, particularly in the region, think about these questions. If you had to give advice, and for this purpose you do have to give advice, to the United States on how it can win over the global south, and particularly the countries of the region of Asia, at a time when the competition between the US and China for geoeconomic strength, for trade agreements on which technology they're going to use, which creates huge past dependency, whether it's a US firm, whether it's Huawei, whatever it might be. What's the US got in its locker that it can bring out to try and make the case in that crucially important regional and global competition?
4 words. Be nice to allies. Seriously. Be nice to allies. Here's the reason I say that. When you're in a competition, this is an epic, multi-decade competition. If we did a typical exercise here at the Kennedy School, if we asked the students, okay, objectively, on a series of matrices, who's more powerful, the US or China? Military power, tech power, and Graham and his studies has done a lot of this. Soft power, economic and trade power. It's pretty close. The Chinese line publicly is, the United States is more powerful. I think we're near peer competitors. However, if you add to the American side of the ledger our treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, think of the power that Japan, which operates in many ways extremely closely, diplomatically as well as militarily, with the United States, of the Philippines, opening up 9 bases to American forces over the last 2.5 years, of Australia, of India as a strategic partner, and add NATO. Why? Because every time I needed help in limiting what the Chinese are doing, or what Jake needed help, or the president did, we turned to NATO and the European Union. They had a declared policy. Both of them said China is a systemic rival, and their weight economically and militarily helped us. So then the comparison is, more than 60% of global GDP is with the United States on significant questions having to do with China's behavior in the world. Why would we forsake our allies? And I'm also, as was announced, a former ambassador to NATO, and I can tell you that NATO went into Afghanistan with us, as General Dunford knows. They went into Iraq with us. We've trained together. And I'll just say briefly, on 9/11, I was a very new NATO ambassador. And the Canadian ambassador, think of ironies here, was the first person to come to me 3 hours after the attack. We were trying to figure out what was happening. David Wright, who now teaches at the University of Toronto, he said, have you thought about invoking Article 5? This is the article of the treaty, an attack on one of us shall be considered an attack on all. And he said, I think all the allies would agree by tomorrow. And that was his idea. And his prime minister took the lead to support us. And the next morning, every ally came forward and said, we're going to invoke this article. I figured I needed adult supervision. I called Condi Rice, whom I knew very well. She was in the Situation Room. It was 4 a.m. after the attacks. I said, Condi, the allies want to invoke Article 5. She said, go for it. I said, Condi, thank you. And I'm calling to get the president's personal instruction to invoke Article 5. She said, go for it. I tried a third time. I said, but I really need the president. She said, he's had a really bad day. Go for it. But then I said, okay, I'll take that as my presidential instruction, and we will vote for Article 5, which we knew the day after the attack meant Osama bin Laden. And we knew it meant probable military action. So the allies were going to fight with us. She said to me, before you go down and vote for this, I want to say one more thing. I said, what's that? She said, it's good to have friends in the world. And I've never forgotten that. And I've thought about it a lot in the last couple of months. All of the talk against NATO, demeaning allies, challenging the sovereignty of Denmark, challenging the sovereignty of Canada, suggesting, not joking, that Canada should be the 51st state. This makes no sense for the United States. The allies build us up. They're our best friends. They never forsake us. We argue about lots of things with the allies, but they're always there when we need them. So my advice is, build your alliances and be nice to them because you need them. That was my experience in government.
Well, fortunately, I think, Nick, it's fair to say that every single nationality you've mentioned and more are present here at HKS, and I think probably in the audience today. So I'm going to call on my allies, I hope, in the audience to come to the 4 microphones that you'll see placed, I think 2 at this level, 2 upstairs. And if you want to line up, we'll take questions from the audience to Ambassador Nick Burns, Professor Nick Burns, as I should now redub you, I think, on this case. Let's start on this side here. And if you feel comfortable, please do just give us your name and your affiliation as well. And if not, just claim your name as Dave. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you so much, Ambassador Burns, for being here. My name is Mike. I'm currently a sophomore at Harvard College studying applied math. And I think it was just super wonderful to hear you speak about Chinese students because I'm one of those 277,000 Chinese students who came here before COVID and one of those who stayed after COVID. So I think it was wonderful that you speak about our experience here. But my question is about the ICE deportation that just happened last week in Boston with one of the Tufts students, because I think one of the major concerns I'm facing right now is what the US government is seeing, like what status are Chinese students seeing as one of the non-American student groups in the States. Because I do think as Chinese students, there's a looming trade war that's going on. I think there's various security reasons that we don't have access to the highest technology or majors that we can study here. And especially in the college and graduate school at Harvard, I think a lot of those concerns are very relevant. So I'm just wondering, like, what role do you think Chinese students can play, at least in the near future, during Trump's administration?
Thank you, Mike. Nick.
Mike, thank you for your question. I don't want to comment on what happened with the Turkish student from Tufts for one reason. I don't know the facts. I just don't know them. And I have too much respect for law enforcement, and law enforcement's critical in our rule of law society. So I don't want to comment on something I don't know anything about, number one. Number two, I hope Chinese students feel welcome in this country. You are welcome. You're welcome to this university, obviously, but you're welcome in the country. And I hope you build long-lasting relationships with American students here. Number three, I can certainly understand, given what's happening and given some of the examples that are out there over the last couple of weeks, that Chinese students and other students from around the world are going to feel anxious and worried. And it's day one, it's my first day, but at our faculty meeting, it was made clear to us that, you know, there are resources, there are numbers you can call. I think there's been an email to all of the international students saying, if you've got questions about your status, if anyone questions you, here's what you should do. Here's what you should talk to. So the university does want to be supportive of you. And I think if you have any doubt about that, there are lots of people. We can talk afterwards. I'm not the person probably, but we can direct you to the right person.
Thank you, Nick. Let's take a question up here, I think. Yeah, please, get and to give your name.
Hi, my name is Lori Alto. I'm in film at Harvard. I live with three girls that have fellowships. They're all England, Finland, and China. She is actually a professor at Duke University in China. Her husband is also a professor, and she's doing her fellowship at Harvard. But my question for you is, when you sit down at the table with the Chinese government, what do you see the difference between what the American government wants and what the Chinese want? What do they want to have a better relationship with America?
So thank you for your question. It's a big question. There's a lot that goes into this relationship. I think I can only speak from my own experience representing President Biden and observing and talking to the Chinese over the last 3.5 years. I think the government in China wants a stable relationship with the United States. They don't want to see it descend into conflict. They're worried about foreign direct investment. It's declined by 30% over the last year. So there's a big effort now in conversations with U.S. officials, but also with the U.S. business community to keep the American business presence there, and it's huge, over 10,000 companies, number one. Number two, I think they do want to work, with the United States on a series of multilateral, big global issues like climate change, and we took that very seriously, both John Kerry and John Podesta, who are our two climate envoys for President Biden, and they worked really hard. We didn't agree on everything. We disagreed with methane levels, nitrous oxide, coal plants, but we also understood we were the two largest carbon emitters and had some responsibility to each other as well as to the global commonwealth in order to do something about climate change. So that worked pretty well. So I think there are a number of areas where we agreed what the goal should be, but there were many more where we disagreed. And we've talked about them, the competitive issues in this relationship. But I think my sense of the government in China is a lot of highly educated, very impressive people, many of them with fluent English. Many of them have lived for years in the United States, which is another reason why we need young Americans to have similar experiences in China, because when you're sitting across, as Jake and I have done, and Graham has done this as well with the Chinese leadership, you've got to be on your game. They're sophisticated. They know their facts. One last point. There was often confusion in Beijing about my role and roles of other ambassadors from other countries, to be clear. And maybe it's particular because of the authoritarian nature of the government of China. They kept saying to me until my very last day, we want you to be a bridge and just only be positive and just be a positive bridge between the two countries. And part of my job was to be a bridge, communications bridge, but my only job was to represent the president and the United States. And I marveled that they sustained this campaign to convince me otherwise for nearly 3.5 years. But I think it's important as you think about what diplomats do, whether you're a Chinese diplomat or the American diplomat, sure you want to connect governments, but you represent one government, not both governments.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to try and give each mic at least one question, so I think we've got one over here. And again, do tell us who you are, if you would.
Yeah. Hi, Ambassador. Thank you for coming to speak with us at Forum today. My name is Safina. I'm a first year at the college studying government and astrophysics. And that's actually what my question is about. You've talked a little bit...
I'm not an expert on astrophysics. I'll try.
It's more policy related. But you've talked a little bit about how the main relationship between China and the US is technological competition. And advances in space technology have often been linked to politics, like the space race, for example. However, there have been concerns that the notion of space as a global commons is eroding. There were reports, I think 2 days ago, that China is practicing dogfighting with satellites in space, which is sort of a policy gray area. So my question is, how do you approach diplomacy in areas where there's little precedent, such as emerging scientific and technological developments in space? And how do you see diplomacy developing in these areas?
The future of diplomacy, you might say, Nick.
Exactly. Thank you. This is a very important question, and one that's largely unresolved, and frankly, even not discussed very much, not because we're not trying, with the Chinese leadership. I'll just expand your question, if you'd let me a little bit. If you think about the rapid growth in Chinese nuclear weapons program, trying to achieve parity with us. This is in our annual, our public unclassified Defense Department report. Every year catalogs this. China has largely refused to talk to the United States about this. If you think about the danger of space-based weapons and a competition in space, and then add a third category, which is cyber, and just, Google Chris Wray's public statements. Our very good former FBI director, Chris Wray, his public statements at the Munich Security Conference in 2023, his testimony unclassified to Congress about the cyber offensive of the People's Republic of China against the United States, our industry, our grid. These are forbidding issues. Graham, who's the founding dean, Graham Allison, Professor Allison of our school, wrote the great book, the greatest book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we still study today. He has spent his whole career focused on this issue. In that old Cold War, and I'm old enough that the first 10 years of my career were the old Cold War, we managed, President Kennedy started it, to talk to our most powerful rival about the most sensitive issues, beginning with the Test Ban Treaty in 1963. And it was our belief that in the Biden administration, we should be able to talk about these issues largely shut down by the Chinese. And when our allies try to talk to the Chinese about these really important issues, and I'm glad you're majoring or minoring or astrophysics, they refuse to discuss it. Even today, there are conversations between the United States and Russia about arms control, but not with China. We managed to have one meeting, we made it public, we issued a statement this past autumn at the Assistant Secretary of State level to talk about nuclear weapons. It lasted about 3 hours, and then the Chinese told me later, no more meetings. So I think it's another challenge for China. It wants to be a great power. It says it wants to be responsible, and yet this is not responsible. It's not responsible to our relationship, to their own citizens, and to the world. It's a really important question you've just asked.
We'll see what more we can squeeze in. I think this microphone is also open. Please, do give us your question and your name, if you could.
Thank you, Dr. Burns, Ambassador Burns, for being here. My name is Laith Mustafa. I'm a master's student at the Fletcher School. You mentioned both events, the balloons events in June 23 and the San Francisco summit. Following both of these events, Biden branded Xi Jinping as a dictator. I'm wondering, how do you view, I feel like this echoes not just Mr. Biden's words, but also academia and policymakers in the US, particularly the dominance of liberal political theory. On the other hand,
Sorry, sir, could you make sure to get to the question because the time is a little short?
Yes,
What's your question?
Yes, yeah.
Professor Burns?
2 seconds. Professor Graham Allison here made a bet in January that he believes the status of Sino-American relations will be improved.
But your question, sir, what's the question?
And my question, how will U.S.-Chinese relations improve given the limitations of dominance of liberalism in U.S. as opposed to realist political thought?
I'm very glad you see dominance of liberalism in the U.S. at the moment, sir. Not everyone else does, but Nick, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. I think we have probably insufficient information or data right now based on 2.5 months of the Trump administration about whether or not the U.S. and China can achieve a stable relationship while we compete, because we're going to compete. The administration, just to give it a break, is dealing with a lot of economic issues, with the tariff issues, and with the Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine issue. And we haven't seen a series of statements that really explain what their theory of the case is about U.S.-China relations. So I'm sure we'll see it. But what we do know is that President Trump is leading with economic issues, with the tariffs, that there have been discussions between our new trade negotiator and Vice Premier Hurley Fung last week. Jameson Greer had that discussion, but very little senior level contact. So I don't want to criticize the administration at all, because I don't think they've really revealed what they intend to do. I don't know about the public guess or estimate that Professor Allison made, and he would be a better judge of that. But I would say that, from what I can see, President Trump wants to have a close relationship with President Xi. That was true of President Biden as well. And that they've been talking about a summit meeting. We'll see if one is held. But in the Chinese system, you've got to get to that summit because Xi Jinping is the person who decides everything. And so there has to be a summit meeting at some point for this relationship to take on a fuller dimension than it has. I'm not dodging the question, it hasn't been as fully articulated as one might have expected.
It's very early still. We've got time, if we've got a very quick question and a quick answer, to squeeze the last one in. Go ahead, sir.
Sure.
Welcome back, Ambassador, and welcome back, runner as well. My name is Qi Xuan, second-year MPA. Student from China, but also have a lot of good friends and even relatives in Taiwan. So I think the person like me, we want to keep the peace between the Taiwan Strait. And one thing you mentioned that U.S. government is trying very hard to constrain the Beijing side to keep the peace. But I was wondering, what do you think about the U.S. standpoint right now in constraining the peace on the Taipei side, considering the President Lai these days is different one, compared with his predecessor, kind of claiming the China mainland as an overseas rival, and also he kind of be more pro-Taiwan independence compared with any other president ever in the history.
Very clear question, thanks. We'll just squeeze in a very quick answer, Nick, to a very complex question.
And I think the new president and his government have been very much responsible when it comes to the cross-strait differences that they have. They've even offered, as you know, publicly conversations, which the People's Republic has turned down. It's not the Taiwan authorities who are launching these repeated simulations of military intimidation, like the ones today. So I actually wouldn't point at the Taiwan authorities. I think the larger problem is the activities of the PLA and of the government of China trying to intimidate the Taiwan authorities. And we are absolutely right, our country, to be true to our commitments to build up their deterrence and to urge the Chinese government in Beijing, they've got to acquit themselves in such a way that makes peace possible. And they've got to commit themselves to a peaceful resolution. They don't agree, but that's been our position for half a century, and it's the right position for us to take. Thank you.
Nick, as we begin to finish off, I'm going to forgive you for what I think you said earlier, which was that you heard a talk by me and then you left the country for 3.5 years immediately afterwards. Because by doing so, it's very clear, I think, from our conversation that the interest of the United States and actually much of the wider world was in the most capable hands during your time in Beijing, an immensely difficult relationship which you handled clearly with great aplomb. Having said that, Beijing and Washington's loss is our gain. It's such a pleasure to have you back with our community, to give your wisdom, not starting today, but for many years to come, we hope. And I think everyone here has appreciated your time and your conversation. Could you please thank Ambassador Professor Nicholas Burns?
Thank you.